Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast.
Welcome, everyone, to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. I'm Professor Christopher Jain Miller, and I am joined here by my colleague Sailesh Rao, the founder and executive director at Climate Healers. Welcome, Sailesh, and thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
It's good to have you here. We worked on several things together. I know we've been on podcasts, we've been on some of your events with Climate Healers before, and Arihanta Institute and Climate Healers have been working more closely together, and I'm very excited to interview you today about your work, about maybe your book, anything you want to talk about, as well as a course that you're going to be teaching here at Arihanta Institute in collaboration with us as one of our partners. So it's really wonderful to be able to give people an opportunity on the podcast, whether they're driving or walking or whatever they're doing right now, to be able to hear about your wonderful work with Climate Healers, which I'm a big fan of and very supportive of, and as we know is a very necessary thing in today's world. So as we get started here, I just wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself to the audience, give us a little bit of your bio, your background, your interests, and what made you come to the founding and eventually becoming the executive director of Climate Healers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. I'm an engineer by profession. So I did my electrical engineering in India. And then I went to Stanford for my PhD, where I worked at the Information Systems Laboratory. Now, this is important because it was the systems grounding that I got at ISL that helped me in making this transition from internet communications to the environment. And I did that in 2005 when I saw Al Gore's presentation on TV, and I was so shocked by what he was saying that I told my wife, if half of what he's saying is true, everybody should be working on this problem. You know? And so she was, she told me, if you think it's that important, why don't you look into it? So that started me on this journey of looking at the environment. And within 3 months, I told her we have to close our company and focus on this full time. And she agreed. And so we did that. And I wrote to Mr. Gore and I said, how can I help you? So that's how I got started. And then I realized that Mr. Gore wasn't talking about the whole problem. He was missing out on the cultural side of things, like the food system, which is key to what's happening in the environment. And if you don't talk about the food system, you're missing, like, in my opinion, 90% of the problem. So I started Climate Healers in 2007, just 2 years after I discovered that there is a problem like this. And the idea of Climate Healers, behind founding Climate Healers, was to work on solving climate change as an engineer would, which requires you to define the problem accurately, characterize the solution space, and then understand what are the feasible solutions within that solution space. And how do you go about implementing that? So I started off as if it was an engineering project, and that's how I've been working on it. I've never worked on the same thing for 18 years before. This is the first time that since founding Climate Healers in 2007, I've been working on the same thing for 18 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And you point out something really interesting because you mentioned Al Gore, and we know that he and others were sounding the alarm early on when we knew we had to get to work here on doing something about this, all the climate issues that are converging. And one of the things that often gets left out in these conversations, almost, I don't know what percent of the time, Sentient Media, I think, recently had an article on how little media coverage there is
Right.
regarding how our food habits are affecting the climate. It's such an underappreciated habit of ours, and also the systems, as you mentioned, that create this problem. And I know you've published a bit on it and you're writing about it. Do you want to say a little bit about your research, past and future and present, with regard to food systems and its effect on the climate?
Well, right from the outset, I had an inkling of the impact of the food system because during Al Gore's training, which happened in 2006, I was part of the second batch that he trained. I asked him this question because I was doing back of the envelope calculations. And at that time in 2006, the consensus was that 1/3 of the land area of the planet is desert, 1/3 is forest, and 1/3 is grazing land, roughly. Okay. And I also knew that land was storing like twice as much carbon as the atmosphere. And I was guessing that most of it is in the forest, not in the grazing land or the desert. So I asked Al Gore, if we just restore forests on grazing land, can we not reverse this? And I was doing back of the envelope calculations. And he immediately turned to Roy Neal, his chief of staff, and he said, how did this guy get in here? So I realized that there was something there that no one wants to talk about. And when I find out that there is something that no one wants to talk about, I know that that's where the solution is. So I keep at it. So I kept at it. And the more I unearthed what was going on in the food system, the more it became obvious that that is the leading cause of climate change. In fact, not only is it the leading cause of climate change, it is the leading cause or the leading solution to all 6 planetary boundary transgressions that are happening in the planet. So basically, in the life support systems of the planet, there are 6 transgressions in the life support systems of the planet, and every one of them, if you change the food system, you will reverse it. You would bring it back from the red to green, or closer towards green. Okay, and the only one that we are focusing on is climate change of the 6 transgressions. And within that, we are framing it as a fossil fuel issue. It's not even the truth. We are framing it like that. And this way, we can have a green growth story for solving climate change, and we can continue the current system. So the system is set up in such a way that we are always looking for a solution that fits within the system. So I call it a constraint optimization problem. It's what everyone is trying to do. And in this case, there is no constraint optimization that will solve the problem. Okay, because there are 6 planetary boundary transgressions, not just one. Climate change is not even the worst. It's only the 4th worst transgression. So that is the book I'm writing. I'm writing a book called There is a Planet B. And I'm pointing out that Planet A, which is the system that we are in, is actually founded on several falsehoods. And the falsehoods have to do, 2 of them have to do with the food system. The first falsehood is that protein is only found in meat or animal foods. It's not stated in that way, but it's sort of implied to you in your science textbooks. So we are told we always associated protein with meat or protein with animal foods. And people tend to think that that's where it is. You don't find protein anywhere else. Or they tell you that other protein are low quality compared to animal protein. And that is also based on measuring the quality to make animal protein look like the highest quality. So it's all based on how fast the growth is, based on eating the protein. We happen to be a mammal with the slowest growth requirement among all the mammals. This is why human breast milk has the least amount of protein compared to any other breast milk, including rat milk or mouse milk, is the lowest amount of protein in terms of calories. Because we are the slowest to grow. Our babies take 2 years, to even stand up and be independent, right? Whereas all other mammals, they do it within a few hours to a few days to a few weeks because they have to run away from predators. So their milk has much higher concentration of growth hormones and protein than ours. So this is why the association of animal foods with protein is a falsehood that actually serves us very poorly. I mean, it makes us sick. So that's the first falsehood. The second falsehood is calcium is only found in milk, specifically cow's milk. This is again sort of implied to you in your textbooks. They associate calcium with cow's milk, with dairy milk or dairy products. And you tend to think, oh, that's where it is. There is no other source of calcium. And in reality, there's plenty of calcium in all your foods. Yeah? So that then, those two things make us selectively seek animal foods for our well-being. Where do you get your protein? I'm sure you heard that. Where do you get your calcium? I'm sure you heard that if you're a vegan. Because people have been told that that's where it is. So those two falsehoods automatically make people go and seek animal foods selectively, as the preferred foods for them to eat. And this creates a lack of food at the bottom. And this automatically creates starvation at the bottom. It creates people dying of hunger at the bottom. We have like 8 million people dying of hunger-related causes because they don't have enough food to eat. Even though we are extracting 6 times as much food as we need from the planet. So we are living in a food system that is so absurd when you look at it from an engineering perspective. It's like, what? Who designed this? And then I realized it's not design. It just happens based on these axioms. Okay, those are the first 2 axioms. The third axiom is human well-being necessitates unfettered economic growth. And that drives the economic system. Everybody's trying to grow the economy. Every corporation is trying to grow. I mean, we all do that too. Arihanta wants to grow. Climate Healers wants to grow. We want to grow the number of people that we influence and so on. Everyone wants to grow, right? But certain growth is actually bad for you. A certain growth has to be promoted. So it's, there is a discernment that needs to happen. Which growth should be promoted? Which one should be curtailed? But when everyone is trying to grow, everything is trying to grow, you automatically create a system that destroys the planet. So everyone is trying to get all the exotic foods that they can eat. So that drives the extraction of more and more food from the planet and to waste a lot of it. So that's the third axiom that drives the system. And the fourth axiom is something that I introduced based on Climate Healers, which is that fossil fuels are the leading cause of climate change, which is false. In fact, we now have evidence that when you count the heating gases that come from fossil fuels and the cooling gases that come from burning fossil fuels have been a net zero almost. It only caused like 2% of the heating because the cooling gases have compensated for all the heating that fossil fuels have done. And the vast majority of the heating that we are experiencing today was caused by animal agriculture. So that's the paper I wrote in 2021, saying that animal agriculture is responsible for at least 87% of greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. When we take into account the opportunity cost of the land that we're using to grow animals. And opportunity cost is something that you have to use if you're a good engineer. If you don't consider opportunity cost, you're not a good engineer. So that's, in a nutshell, is how I see the system. And then you have to figure out, okay, what are the correct axioms and how do you build a system that works for all of us?
Right. And so the title of the course that you're teaching for us in the Compassion Studies Initiative, which focuses on human to human compassion, which is of course inseparable from compassion towards the environment and the climate. The title of that course is Compassionate Food Systems for Planetary Healing. And as I hear you going through these axioms and these falsehoods and the planetary boundaries, I wonder if you, as we get into kind of talking about what this means, compassionate food systems for planetary healing, you could give us an example of how you said some things there, such as those at the bottom go into starvation. And
Right.
what is it about the food system as you're describing it? I mean, very technically, like what is it about the food system that causes those at the bottom, so to speak, to go into starvation due to the things you described, such as the falsehoods around protein and calcium? What happens? What's the connection there for people who may be hearing this for the first time?
Yeah, any system has an objective function that it's based on. People are generally optimizing it for that objective function. What is it? So you ask, for the global food system, what is the objective function? And the objective function is to ensure that the richest person has access to the most exotic food at any given time. That's what the food system is optimized for. It's not optimized to ensure that every human being has access to adequate nutrition at any given time. If you were to design a system for the second objective function that I just mentioned, you would design a completely different food system. Okay. And we know how to do that too. But then that has to be based on the correct axioms. Because if people believe that protein is only found in animal foods, they're going to be hankering for animal foods. Because 95% of Americans believe that if they don't eat meat, they're going to wither away and die. Because that's what they were taught in schools. Okay? And we are still teaching children these things in schools. And it's kind of implied, it's not, you cannot accuse the scientists of lying when they wrote the textbooks. They just said protein is found in meat. They just forgot to tell you that protein is also found in plants. Right? That, in fact, some of the largest land animals just eat plants, like elephants and rhinos and hippopotamus. They only eat plants, and they get to be huge. But we don't think like that. We think maybe we need a different kind of protein than the animals. And therefore, we have to eat animal food to get protein for ourselves. That's the implication, right? So as long as people are hankering for that, and they believe that they really need it in order to survive, this system is going to create starvation at the bottom. Because the animals are only providing us with 12% of the food we eat in terms of dry weight. So dry weight is how we measure when you want to measure apples to oranges to meat. We take the water out and measure what is left in the food. Okay, that's the dry weight. So in terms of dry weight, 12% of the food comes from land animal sources, 3% of the food comes from the ocean, and 85% of the food comes from plants already. So we are all eating a lot of plants already. So when people say we want a plant-based food system, I say you already have a plant-based food system. You want a plant-pure food system. Because just for that 12% of the food that we eat that comes from land animal sources, we are feeding our animals 5 times as much food as we eat.
Right.
Overall, that's how much they're eating.
Right. So what I'm hearing here is that the compassionate food system is a plant-based food system, and the plant-based food system cuts out the animal out of the equation, the non-human animal out of the equation, and therefore opens up that land and reduces the amount of climate change causing greenhouse gases from the animal.
Not only causing, it also sequesters.
Also sequesters.
Because when the trees come back, they sequester all the extra carbon in the atmosphere, and you literally heal the climate.
Right. So if we have trees and rewilding in areas where there used to be just grazing, for example,
Right.
it will
Right.
sequester also the carbon and anything else, and it will eliminate the methane and types of emissions coming from the
Right.
animals themselves, which I think is also, in addition to the health concerns that people have about not eating things from animals. There's also this myth that somehow animals aren't a contributing factor, but you've said something about that. I mean, can you say something about the emissions in particular from animals and what that means right now in terms of our global food system?
Yeah. So animals, they emit carbon dioxide. They breathe carbon dioxide when they're eating and they're growing. Okay. They also, in order to feed the animals, we're chopping down trees everywhere. So we're chopping down like 30 to 40 million acres worth of forests every year to grow the animal food system. Okay. And those trees were storing a lot of carbon, and that's gone when you chop it down. That's one major source of emissions. Okay. Second is the animals we raise who are ruminants. They eat food that goes down to one stomach, where it gets digested by bacteria in the absence of oxygen, which means it produces a lot of methane gas in the stomach. And then they regurgitate the food, chew it, and put it into the next stomach. And every time they regurgitate, they're belching out methane from their mouths. So from their mouths, they're belching out way more methane than they do from any other source. So they are the leading cause of methane emissions into the atmosphere. And methane is such a powerful greenhouse gas that it's estimated to have caused half the heating on the planet so far. So of the right now it's 1.5 degrees Celsius of heating that has happened. At least 0.7 degrees Celsius came from methane emissions alone.
And if I'm understanding methane emissions correctly in this regard, is it not true that the methane emissions will also be the quickest to kind of dissipate once they are no longer in the atmosphere or being put into the atmosphere, as opposed to carbon, which would take much longer?
Yeah, methane reacts with free radicals in the atmosphere, and it becomes CO2. Methane is like, it's natural gas, right? It burns. It burns, and when it burns, it emits CO2. So it has a half-life of less than 9 years, 8.4 years in the atmosphere, which means any amount of methane you put, half of it will disappear in 8.4 years. And then the next half, you know how it goes. It's like an exponential function. So this is why addressing methane is quick, and it has no other baggage around it. Whereas when we burn CO2, when we burn fossil fuels, we're emitting CO2, which is greenhouse gas, but you're also emitting SO2, which is a cooling gas. And that SO2 is masking, right now we're estimating it's masking about 2 watts per square meter of the heating on the planet, which is huge, because overall we're heating it to about 2.6 watts per square meter, which means if the SO2 is not there, it will go up to 4.6 watts per square meter. And SO2 is such a short-lived gas. It's there only for a few weeks and it disappears. It becomes sulfuric acid in the atmosphere and becomes acid rain. So it's not a good thing to put up there, but it is cooling right now by 2 watts per square meter. So addressing this issue requires us to eliminate animal agriculture as quickly as possible. And this is why I have this sense of urgency, because if we don't do this, we're going to keep building up the amount of SO2, we keep building up the amount of CO2, and it will get harder and harder for us to get out of this. So SO2 is like even though it is cooling the atmosphere, it's like a noose around our neck, waiting to heat us up as soon as we stop the fossil fuels within a few weeks, right? So this is why we need to go vegan as quickly as possible, start sucking down the CO2 in the new trees that will be born. We have actually cut half the trees on the planet over the last 10,000 years. There used to be 6 trillion trees, now there are only 3 trillion trees. So if we bring back the 3 trillion trees, they will immediately start sucking down the CO2 from the atmosphere. And then we can dial down the fossil fuels. Slowly. Don't do it quickly. You have to do it slowly, because if you do it quickly, this SO2 will disappear quickly. Okay? So there is There's an optimum rate at which you can slow down this CO2 emissions from fossil fuels. Okay? And that optimum sort of makes sure that it doesn't overheat, as you're lowering.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate your background training in systems engineering and being able to understand how all these parts fit together, because you look at it as a system, as an engineer would, and it's an ecosystem, right? So you see how all these pieces fit together in a very particular way that is compelling, and I know you've published about, and you will be publishing more about. And I think so far you've kind of defined the urgency of the situation at hand, right? I mean, this is an urgent situation. We've talked a little bit about what a compassionate food system would be, a plant-based food system that would allow for this replanting and rewilding, a sequestering of carbon, reduction and eventual elimination of methane very quickly. Here's my question, because that makes sense to me from much of what I've seen in public science on climate science, and sometimes I teach courses that involve some of that public climate science. It all makes perfect sense what you're saying to me right now. My question then comes, how do we implement this? And I know this is something that you're talking about, you're writing about, you're going to teach about it in your course. How do you implement a compassionate food system like this, given the many economic, political, cultural boundaries that seem to be kind of standing in the way?
Yeah, they seem to be standing in the way, but there is an intention to solve the problem. The UN has these Sustainable Development Goals, where the UN has said that we need to get to zero hunger and no poverty, good health and well-being, and so on. So then you can say, okay, let's take it seriously. Let's address this seriously, right? So how do you get to zero hunger? You have to make sure that everyone has access to this food. Okay? Everyone has access to healthy food. Beyond unhealthy food, I don't mind you having to, pay for it and having to scrounge for it and so on. But healthy food, fruits, vegetables, nuts, grains, seeds, whole foods, should be widely available. So that's how I would try to implement it. I would say, okay, let's change the goal of the food system to address zero hunger and good health and well-being. The two Sustainable Development Goal number 2 and goal number 3. Okay, so let's change it so that that's the goal of the food system, not to make sure that the richest person has access to the most exotic food on the planet, which is what it's designed for now, right? So when you do that, now you have to create a different flow of food from producer to consumer. You have to create a different flow of food, and you have to make sure that at least the basic food has to be given away for free. Okay, healthy food to be given away for free. And then if you want to use oil and fry things, and then I don't mind, saying people have to pay for that. Because you have to think of this as firefighting on the planet. So we are all firefighters. We have to replant 3 trillion trees. We have to restore the original forests. We have to take count of all the biodiversity that we lost, and we have to clean up the mess we have made. So we are doing this kind of firefighting and cleaning on the planet, and firefighters have to be fed. You shouldn't be asking them, hey, where is your money for me to feed you? So there has to be a system set in place where healthy food is given away for free. A public system, and it has to be supported by the public. Okay? Through tax dollars or whatever. And eventually you'll realize that the entire system needs to change, including the currency mechanism. So that I want to lead people through the logical thinking. Okay, if that's your goal, how would you implement it? And you'll slowly unravel and you see it's connected to everything else. It's connected to the consumer economy. It's connected to capitalism. Though nowadays capitalism is no longer, the capitalism that we know. It's more or less feudalism is what it's become. So techno-feudalism is what people are calling it now. So it's come around full circle to the original. And to me, in my book, I claim that it's actually a mask that got taken off, because it's always been techno-feudalism. It's always been feudalism.
Right. Yeah. A lot of people are starting to realize this now, especially with the widespread information you can access and a lot of
Right,
misinformation as well on social media. But you see a lot more people having this kind of conversation in daily life, more so than when I was growing up as a kid. We weren't talking about any of this, but now everybody's talking about it.
right,
Young people are also aware of what's happening, and it is alarming, and at the same time, an opportunity, I guess you could say, for rethinking all of these systems as other people are coming into leadership around the world. I also like how you have aligned it with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, because, as you say, even if we're not talking about the environment, if we want to start talking about human health and starvation, if we
right,
start there as a starting point of great human compassionate intention, then the answer remains the same. The answer doesn't change. It still involves a plant-based, global plant-based food system, and one which would solve those problems as well as the others directly related to the climate.
right, right.
One of the other things that I forgot to ask you about earlier too is the people who are working in this system. I mean, there are human beings working in this mostly non-plant based system in terms of creating human food. I mean, what are
Mhm.
they going through, and how does a plant-based system maybe kind of change their lives for the better?
Oh, absolutely. The worst job in the world is slaughterhouse work. And because it has the highest turnover rate. Right? So people really don't want to work there. And they're being forced to work there because of hunger. So you can see how hunger at the bottom is a necessary, they think of it as a necessary evil to drive the economy. So there are lots of jobs that no one would do otherwise. You know?
Yeah.
So when you have a volunteer-based system where everyone is doing what they are good at, a lot of these things will automatically die off. No one will ever want to slaughter an animal, industrial scale like that. Okay? It'll disappear. So when you address that as a hunger problem, and that too, using goals that we have already agreed on. That's the thing with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Every nation has already agreed on. But they also, in the Sustainable Development Goals, put a redundant goal called goal number 8, which is economic growth. Now, I asked the question, when I proved it's a redundant goal by asking people, hey, if you have zero hunger, no poverty, good health and well-being, quality education, if you meet all the other goals, do you care that the economy is growing? And everyone said no. If you meet all the other goals, why do I care that some number is growing? You know? So when you take that goal out, because what is happening now is that everyone is focusing on that goal number 8. And we are all pretending to meet the other goals by just focusing on economic growth. You're saying that somehow it will trickle down to those people and poverty will be eliminated and hunger will be eliminated and so on. I'm saying, no, you have to focus on those goals. Those are the primary goals, not economic growth. Economic growth is this redundant goal. So I say, take it out. Anytime someone gives me a whole bunch of goals to meet, I look for redundant goals and take it out. Because otherwise I cannot do my job properly. So that's the systems perspective, right? So unfortunately, because I build things that actually work. That's my goal when I start something. When I worked on the internet, that was my goal. It wasn't that I can pretend to work on the internet and I'll get salary for it. No, ultimately, I have to show that it works. Otherwise, I'll be fired. You know, everybody, every engineering project has a deadline that you have to meet.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think your training as an engineer puts a very kind of pragmatic approach to setting the
right,
right goal intention and then finding a way to make it work. And I mean, we're seeing that in cases where it does work, because there is so much of a plant-based food system already growing. Uh, and even people who aren't completely plant-based or vegan yet are reducing. I know here in Europe, for example, I know a lot of people who intentionally reduce for the climate in particular, right? And out of compassion for our shared planet. And So we're seeing it happen already. I guess it's a matter of now making it the system. That would be the way forward, and would be
Right.
the way to create a compassionate uh, food system for planetary healing. Yeah.
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 So, but I think there is also a need for religions to get involved. Okay, why? Because the system as it is going to resist the plant-based foods from growing, because it's a threat. If threat to capitalism is a threat to, because it's going to shrink the entire food footprint by a factor of 6. As I told you, we are taking 5 times as much food and feeding it to our animals. So there's a whole economy around that. Okay, so it's going to fight. So how do you overcome that? And that's what I've been thinking about. How do you overcome that? And the best way I can think of is for the religions of the world to start handing out healthy food for free. In temples, in mosques, in churches, everywhere. Because religions have a lot of grassroots base already built in. And feeding their flock is part of our ethos in most religions. Yeah? Except nowadays, it's a little bit. You get a little bit, and they add ghee to it or something or the other. It's no longer healthy. So I'm saying, let's make a whole food plant-based food giveaway. In community centers, in religious centers, in temples, mosques, churches, when you implement that, automatically the whole system will turn towards compassion. The compassion food system will be built, by default when you do that. So that's how I would engineer a compassionate food system, and the transition from where we are to a compassionate food system.
I'm glad you brought up the religious topic on this, because a few years ago, I worked with an organization in Southern California called Joy of Sharing. And they did precisely what you're saying. I mean, this is a kind of model of what you're describing, where they came together. It was the Sikhs, it was the Jains, it was Hindus, as well as many other people coming together, their tradition, these dharmic traditions, and serving free vegan meals, particularly to those in need, but I'm sure anyone who would come by. And they did it every weekend. And I think they still are doing that in Southern California. So it's a matter of kind of scaling up that model that you're describing, which works and which gives people joy to serve others out of compassion. The compassion can be transmitted directly through the food itself, through the serving of this plant-based food to others who need it the most. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Part of this compassion studies initiative that we're doing is supported by the Uberoi Foundation, which focuses on spreading the message of the Dharma traditions. And particularly here, we're talking about food and compassion, which is so intimately connected, right?
Yeah. And I have served with the Joy of Sharing, and I've gone there and helped them pack things and. Yeah,
I had a feeling you would know them. I had a feeling you would know who they are.
Yeah.
Wonderful organization. Yeah,
it is. Yeah, it's a wonderful one, and it is, as you said, it brings joy to those who are actually doing the work. It's joyful work, right, when you do things like that. Yeah, and making that not just weekend activity but daily activity. Everyone has to have access to healthy food at any given time. So that's the idea. Everyone has to have access to healthy food at any given time. And unhealthy food is something that they have to look for. Right now, it's the other way around. Unhealthy food is freely available.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. It's 99 cents. And healthy food is expensive. And you have to go look for it. And people think it's exotic and it's elitist and all this nonsense that comes up, right? When in reality, it is the original food for human beings.
Yeah, you're reminding me too of the many, many years I've spent kind of going through India to different ashrams and seeing the food service kind of seva work that takes place, in particularly in various Hindu temples for the poor, and even just for the community, the surrounding community. It didn't have to be for the poor per se. where people gathered around, ate simple, basic, healthy food together that was all plant-based. And it wasn't a question. The line was always there for people to get food every day, right, at a particular time. So nobody went hungry. Everybody had access to basic, healthy food. So scaling up a model like that would be incredible. A system, so to speak, as you would put it.
Right. Yeah. It's like the golden temple everywhere.
A golden temple everywhere. Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Well, Sailesh, I'm so happy you came on the podcast today. And one question I'm asking, I mean, at the end of the podcast, for everyone that I'm interviewing who's participating in the Compassion Studies Initiative, is asking the question to each of you, educators, how can our listeners develop more compassion in their lives today, from your perspective or maybe from this perspective? It's up to you.
Oh, lately I've been thinking a lot about self-compassion first, because when we are compassionate to ourselves, then it exudes, out to the world. And when we are not, when we are sort of self-critical and hard on ourselves, it also reflects in the activism we do. So I'm trying to get all activists, especially vegans, first realize that they belong. We all belong as a species. We belong as a species on this planet. It may look like we are destroying the planet, but have faith and know that it's part of something much, much larger. And have compassion for yourself.
Beautiful. Yeah, beautifully and wonderfully said. I'm really so honored to have you in the Compassion Studies Initiative, to be able to interview you. You'll also be giving a talk in the Compassion Studies, the Voices in Compassion Studies speaker series, as well as speaking at our conference in April, the Earth Day conference or Earth Day weekend conference, Compassion in Action. Dr. Sailesh Rao, thank you so much for being with us here on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. Jai Jinendra.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.